We're studying the subject of wisdom tonight, and the first way to begin is to ask a question which you can answer to yourself. Is all wisdom the same? Think about that a minute. Well, there are different kinds of wisdom, different areas, and that's the question. But as we look at what Solomon wrote here in this chapter, I think sometimes I assume, maybe you do too, that there's just one kind of wisdom. That if you have wisdom, you have wisdom, whether it's of the world, of the Bible, or whatever. That wisdom all fits in one category, and that's it. But as you study the subject of wisdom, as I've done in this lesson, we come to realize that that's not the case. Verse 13, notice again that Solomon said, I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. And so that's a kind of wisdom that is of this world. And he said, this burdensome task God has given to the sons of men by which they may be exercised. And so while we're on the earth, man is trying to become wise in the different affairs of this life. And he said it's a burdensome task, and we'll see why he says that later on. And again in verse 16, he said, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I've attained greatness and obtained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood what? Great wisdom and knowledge. Solomon says, I know things nobody else knows. And when we read the book of Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, we see that he had tremendous knowledge, tremendous wisdom. And as others have told me before, a lot of our motivational speakers in the world actually are borrowing from the Bible and just not telling people where they got it. And that's because God has wisdom the world cannot find. And again, verse 17, I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. Now think about that. In other words, I try to figure out why people act the way they do. What about madness? What makes people act that way? What about folly? Why do people act that way? And he said, I perceive that this also is grasping for the wind. There's no one answer for those questions. And then he warns us when he says, in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases wisdom increases sorrow. Because you understand that some things are never going to be fixed. And what I think we need to realize is that when he makes this statement, it made me stop and think that, we say, well, when you're young and naive, that's a good thing to be. But it may not be as desirable as we like, but on the other hand, the more we understand this life, the more grievous it becomes. And so when we think about what he's saying here, I think there's at least three different kinds of wisdom. The kind he mentions in our lesson tonight, that is wisdom under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 13, and also in the Gospel of Luke chapter 16 and verse 18. And that's talking about the wisdom which makes wise use of the world we live in. It's important, it's something valuable, it's something that will help you in this life. But then also there is the wisdom that is from above, which is a redemptive wisdom. In other words, you have to have that wisdom in order to be saved. And then in verse 15 of James chapter 3, there's the wisdom from below or beneath that is earthly and sensual and demonic, the Bible says. So the devil has his own kind of wisdom. We see that in the Garden of Eden. Very wise, cunning, crafty. Those are all terms that describe a certain type of wisdom. But of course, what we're looking at tonight is the wisdom that's from under the sun. And then Sunday morning, Lord willing, we'll discuss the other two. But now the wisdom under the sun is something that we have to seek for. Solomon's observations and conclusions should be taken seriously because he said, I understood great wisdom and great knowledge. But the warning is, with much knowledge or wisdom comes much grief. The more you understand the inequities of life, the more mistreatment of man to man you see, the more you know about these things, the more difficult life becomes. But he also says this kind of wisdom can only be enjoyed by those who have life. In other words, this wisdom doesn't help you when you leave this world. So in chapter 2 and verse 3, he said, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under the heaven all the days of their lives. So he goes through the experiments trying to find out, well, is that something we should be doing? But he also tells us in chapter 9 and verses 15 and 16 that even though you may be wise, the wise man isn't always treated properly in this life. In verse 15 he said, Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city, yet no one remembered that same poor man. Then I said, Wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words not heard. So just because a fellow's in a place of prominence or influence doesn't mean he's wise. Sometimes the wise man is despised. And then we realize that sometimes the sinner can ruin much good. One bad apple destroys the whole barrel. That's true in life as well. And we also understand by chapter 10 and verse 1 that a wise man who practices a little bit of folly can ruin his reputation. Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and causes it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. So those are some observations worth thinking about. But again, wisdom is attained by one who chooses it and intelligently pursues it. It doesn't just happen. And so often we talk about people who choose a discipline or a career move. That's what we're saying. The fellow says, I'm going to become proficient in this discipline or this area of knowledge and wisdom. And if he pursues that, then it can be had for him. But keep in mind what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. God will one day destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. He says, I'm going to destroy the wisdom of this world that might be good for here and now, but it causes some people to turn against God. So he says, where's the wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the what? The wisdom of this world. Now, you can be worldly wise and not be contrary to God. But as I said already, there's a wisdom that requires you to pursue in order to be redeemed by Christ. So keep those two thoughts in mind. And with all of that in mind, let's go back and see what the Old Testament has to say about wisdom. It's quite interesting, and I'm going to read several passages. If we define wisdom according to the Old Testament, it would be described as wisdom or skill in learning. And this can be referred to in reference to all kinds of things like trade, war, and even spiritual things. And so we get the English dictionary out and compare that to the Bible, and the English dictionary says the quality of having experience and good judgment. And I think that fits. And again, the Oxford English Dictionary says this quality personified, and it's interesting that even the English dictionary knows that often wisdom is personified as a woman. A good example in the Bible is Proverbs chapter 1. But he said, or regarded as expressing the essence or the nature of God. And so wisdom is ultimately the possession of God, and that's true whether you're reading the Bible or reading the description that men give to it. But as we use the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, the uses of wisdom tells us that it covers the whole gamut of human experience. It is seen in the technical work of making garments, for example. Look at Exodus chapter 28 and verse 3 and listen to the words here. So you shall speak to all who are gifted artisans, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him and to minister to me as priest. So there's a wisdom, a skill at making garments, and God said, I had given that wisdom to these artisans so that they can obey my commands, and I find that quite interesting. Now look at chapter 31 of Exodus and verse 3. And again, he goes on to say, I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship, to design artistic works, to work in gold, in silver, in bronze, in cutting jewels for setting, and carving wood, and to work in all manner of workmanship. So God gives instructions to Moses how to make the Ark of the Covenant, how to make the tabernacle, how to make the priest's clothing. If you go back in the Old Testament and read those instructions, now I don't have that wisdom. I'm not a good builder. You've heard me say before that I built a dog house and the dog nearly died. That's because I don't have that wisdom quite like that. But God blessed these men with the understanding of his instructions so that they could do exactly what he commanded. And I think one of the reasons why these instructions in the Old Testament are sometimes obscure to us is because God has left the instructions, but he hasn't always given the men the wisdom to design it, because he doesn't want us to do that today. So that's one way the word wisdom is used, and it refers to the way they make garments. There's a craftsmanship that we read about in metalworks, or the execution of battle tactics. We see that in the Old Testament as well. When they destroyed the city of Jericho, that tactic was not used, but it's used today. Leadership in government administration. Now, these are all examples that the Bible gives in the Old Testament of what the Bible means by wisdom under the sun. And so ask yourself, what skill do you have that could be described as wisdom in this sense? And all of us have different abilities and talents, but you have to stop and think, now, what am I really good at? What's my talent that God has blessed me with? And then when Jesus Christ is going to come to the earth, God blessed him with a wisdom as well, prophesied in Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 2. It says, the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. Listen to this. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And so when Jesus was on our earth, all of his enemies tried to trap him. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Zealots, they all tried. And none of them could withstand his wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. He put all of them to shame. And the Bible tells us in Isaiah chapter 11, Jesus had this wisdom and understanding given to him by God. So keep that in mind. Then secondly, wisdom in the Old Testament is often expressed in the term shrewdness. Now think about the way you use that term. Well, that's a shrewd individual. When do you make that statement? That means somebody is sharp, but to be shrewd means you can do things and almost not be observed. You can do them very subtly and people don't realize it's happening. But in 2 Samuel chapter 20, for example, we have a shrewd woman. There was the rebellion against David, and finally they're putting the rebellion down. And Joab is chasing after a man named Sheba, the son of Bichri. And he runs off to a little town. And Joab and his soldiers surround the town. They build a fortification against it. And they're just about to destroy the whole little town. But there's a wise woman inside that little community. And she sends word to Joab, says, well, I want to talk to Joab. And so it says, come nearby that I may speak with you. When he'd come near to her, the woman said, are you Joab? He said, I am. She said to him, hear the words of your maidservant. And he said, I'm listening. She spoke, saying, they used to talk in former times, saying, they shall surely seek guidance at Abel. And so they would end disputes. I am among the peaceable and faithful in Israel. You to seek to destroy a city and a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord? And Joab answered and said, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. This is not so. But a man from the mountains of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri by name, has raised his hand against the king, against David. Deliver him only, and I will depart from the city. So now, had this one wise woman in the city not done what she did, this whole community would have been destroyed. But the woman said to Joab, watch, his head will be thrown to you over the wall. Then the woman in her wisdom went to all the people, and they cut off the head of Sheba and threw it out to Joab. He blew a trumpet. They withdrew from the city, every man to his tent. So Joab returned to the king at Jerusalem. A strange kind of wisdom that has saved that lady's neck. Job 39 is interesting because God made an ostrich that had no wisdom and certainly no shrewdness. And I want to take the time to read it because it's somewhat comical. Anybody ever go to the zoo and watch an ostrich? They're kind of dumb animals. Well, there's a reason for that. God made them that way. Listen to verse 13. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but her wings and pinions are not like the kindly storks. She leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. In other words, the ostrich just doesn't have much sense. Doesn't have any wisdom, doesn't have any shrewdness. But God gives some men that shrewdness that we're seeing here. But then the Bible even says God can give a man this wisdom under the sun like he did Solomon, and he'll use that wisdom to turn away from God. And so in Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 10, it says, "For you have trusted in your wickedness, you have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you, and you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one else beside me." Now that's the heart of the wicked person. There's no God. Nobody sees what I'm doing. Nobody can keep me from doing what I want to do, so I'm just going to go out and live any old way I want. And God says that's the shrewdness of a worldly wise man, but he's using that wisdom that God gave him to deny the very existence of God. Why? Because he wants to be wicked. So it's kind of ironic that that's the case, but again, this dictionary we're quoting from is the one that's telling us this. Then the word prudence is another aspect of wisdom. That's an old-fashioned name, isn't it? Prudence. There's a basketball player I was watching this afternoon. His name was Precious. He's about 6'10" and probably weighs 300 pounds. I thought, I'm not going to go up and call him Precious. I might get hurt. But prudence is used by those who speak wisely. And that's the meaning of prudence. Someone who has the ability to use their tongue wisely. They don't just blurt out bluntly what it is they're trying to say. They try to be kind about it and use words of wisdom. In Psalm chapter 37 and verse 30, we have an example of this, and so I read this. The mouth of the righteous speaks wisdom, and his tongue talks of justice. The law of his God is in his heart. None of his steps shall slide. So that's that wisdom we're talking about. And then again in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 31, Solomon says about this kind of prudence, we can call it. The mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut out. So it's not a great quality to say, well, I just tell people exactly what I think. Well, maybe you lack wisdom and prudence. You can tell people what you think, but can you use better words so that you won't have trouble? And again, prudence is defined of those who use their time carefully. You know, Ephesians 5 says, considering the time that is evil around us, and so you make wise use of your time. Psalm chapter 9 and verse 12 says, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. And so that's the prudence aspect of wisdom as they define that. Well, again, going back to shrewdness, shrewdness is not a bad thing. Sometimes it has a negative connotation. If we mean by shrewdness cunning and artful, that might mean that somebody has the ability and the sharpness to deceive me and to get me to do something I shouldn't do. That's what Satan did to Eve. You won't die. God knows that if you eat of this tree, you'll be smart as he is. Shrewd, cunning, trying to get her to do something she never would have thought on her own. But on the positive side, the word also means to be astute, sharply perceptive, clever, and judicious. And those are all good qualities. And so we have the example that Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 16 of the unjust steward. He's cheating his master, and his master finds out, and he says, all right, balance the books because you're no longer going to be a steward of mine. You're fired. So he runs around to all the debtors of this master of his, and he says, how much do you owe? And they tell him, he says, well, make it for less, and I'll call it even. And he runs around doing this to all these different debtors, and he's giving them a break so that even though he's cheating his master more, he's figuring out a way that he can himself be provided for when he's cast out. In that sense, Jesus Christ said of that particular individual, the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. Now, he's not saying go out and cheat somebody, but he is saying this fella figured out a way to provide for himself even though he was an unjust individual. And you remember Solomon's example of this shrewdness when two harlots had sons and one rolled over and smothered her baby to death, and now they just have one, and she took the other harlot's baby and claimed it as hers, and they're presented to Solomon. They both say, this is my baby, the dead one belongs to her. And you remember that story, don't you? Yeah. Solomon said, well, that's no problem. Let's just cut the baby in half. You can both have a half. And the one who was not the mother said, that's fine with me. And the one who was actually the mother said, no, she can have the baby. I don't want to see that happen to her. Motherly instinct, motherly love. And of course, the king was said about him that they feared the king, for they saw the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. The wisdom of this world, the shrewdness of being able to figure out how to solve that problem, and not everybody has that talent. And then the woman of Tekoa we just mentioned. You're going to kill all of us? You're going to destroy the inheritance of God in Israel? No. I just need this one fellow. Well, we'll throw his head over to you. And he did survive. So the point we need to make is there's different areas of wisdom that this world offers. There's the wisdom of art. There's the wisdom of mechanics. There's the wisdom of higher knowledge and learning. And all those things are in and of themselves fine. A lot of us have chosen different fields in which to be an expert. And so that is simply seeking after the wisdom that the world offers that really comes from God. And keep that in mind, because if you're pursuing a career in a certain field, serving the Lord and being a Christian and asking Him for wisdom will help you get the very thing you're looking for. It'll make you more shrewd than your competitors. And you can advance in your field above the rest. But what we do need to keep in mind is that no matter how smart a man may be in the wisdom of this world, that doesn't mean he has the wisdom that comes from God. The redemptive wisdom that we're going to be talking about next Sunday morning. A fellow who's wise enough to save his own soul. Because all the worldly wisdom will not save an eternal soul. And it's really sad to see people who have this wisdom of the world, and yet they won't give credit to God. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 6, Paul said, we speak among those who are mature of wisdom, yet not the wisdom of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. And so we need to be sure we distinguish between the two. In doing so, there's nothing wrong pursuing the wisdom of this world. Just be sure that you put it in its proper place. 3 kinds of wisdom. The wisdom from beneath that Satan is the author of. Don't even want to touch that. The wisdom from above that will help you be a spiritually minded, moral, decent human being who not only has the promise of this life, but the hope of eternal life. And then having even gained that, you can enjoy the life under the sun by being a wise person as God had intended for you to be. So I hope that's helped you understand some of this. We haven't talked tonight about what to do to be saved, but if you've learned at a previous time how to become a child of God and you want to choose tonight to do that, that'd be a wise choice, wouldn't it? If you stay with it the rest of your life. If you've fallen by the wayside and you're wise enough to realize that God is long-suffering and patient and merciful and kind, and you want to be saved, again, come forward and avail yourself of what God has offered to you. God's grace and mercy is given to each one of us, and the only way we're going to make it to heaven is by availing ourselves of his kindness and love and compassion. And so whether you need to obey the gospel for the first time or to be restored into his favor once again, this is your opportunity while we stand and sing.